Hello, everyone. I am the sleep storyteller, and I am here to help you today. I know you use this video to fall asleep, so before we begin, make sure to like the video and subscribe to the channel. It really helps out a lot. Also, let me know in the comments, where are you from and what time are you listening? Now get comfortable and relax. The silver moon hung low over the golden leaves of Lothlórien, casting a soft, ethereal glow upon the high talon where Galadriel stood in silence. The night air carried the crisp scent of autumn, mingling with the faint whisper of the Nimrodal as it wove through the trees like an ancient song. Shadows danced upon the shimmering boughs, their gentle rustling a lament for an age that was drawing to its close. Galadriel had known this moment would come. For years beyond counting, she had foreseen the parting, the slow fatting of all she had built. The War of the Ring was over, the great darkness vanquished, and with it, the power that had long sustained her realm was beginning to wane. Lothlórien would endure for a time, but it would no longer be the same without her. The song of the Malorn trees would fade, and one day, silence would settle over the golden wood. She inhaled deeply, the cool night air filling her lungs, yet the weight of the past pressed upon her shoulders, heavier than any burden she had ever borne. The call of the sea was stronger now, an insistent whisper in her heart, an unrelenting tide pulling her toward the distant shores of Valinor. The straight road awaited her, the white ships would soon sail, and yet something held her still. A voice, not of the present, but of the past, drifted through the quiet halls of her memory. A name, a whisper lost to time, Eindillion. She had not spoken it aloud in an age, yet it came to her now, as though carried on the breath of the wind. It stirred something deep within her, a memory, half-formed and lingering at the edge of her mind, waiting to be remembered. Before the fall of Numenor, before even the breaking of the world, there had been another story, another choice, now buried beneath the weight of centuries. Galadriel turned her gaze eastward beyond the forests, beyond the misted mountains, toward the ruins of a land swallowed by the sea. Once, the great cities of the Eldar had stood proud beneath the light of the two trees. Once, there had been a secret hidden even from the wise, a relic of light, older than the Third Age, older than Gondor, older even than the rings of power. Her fingers brushed the wooden railing of the talon, the silver threads of her gown catching in the moonlight. She had never spoken of it, not even to Celeborn. It was a thing lost to time, a whisper of another world. And yet, she knew now that before she left Middle-earth forever, she must seek it. A soft footstep upon the stair stirred her from her thoughts. She did not turn. She already knew the presence that approached. "My lady," came the voice, gentle as a breeze over still waters. "Lord Elrond." He stepped beside her, his gaze following hers into the dark. In his eyes, she saw the wisdom of many lifetimes, and in his heart, she knew he carried the same longing for the West that she did. "You have heard it then," she murmured, her voice scarcely more than a whisper. Elrond did not answer at once. His hands rested upon the railing, fingers trailing lightly over the polished wood. At last, he spoke. There are few whispers I have not heard in these waning days. And yet, I did not think to hear that name again. Galadriel inclined her head slightly. Then you remember. Elrond's face was solemn, his gray eyes dark with memory. Eindillion, a name lost to all but the eldest among us, a name tied to a past we had thought forgotten. He turned to her then, searching her gaze. Why now? Her golden hair shimmered in the moonlight as she lowered her eyes. Because I have seen what will come after us, Elrond. And I fear that not all of the darkness has been vanquished. His brow furrowed, but he did not speak. I do not speak of Sauron or his servants, for they are ended, she continued. But there are remnants of the past, things left unfinished. I feel it in the marrow of the earth, in the shifting of the winds. Elrond was silent for a time. Above them, the stars wheeled slowly, their cold light distant and unchanging. At last, he spoke. If you go, it will not be a simple journey. The world has changed. The ruins of Beleriand lie deep beneath the sea. What remains is forgotten. Not all, Galadriel said, her voice quiet yet firm. The relic still lingers, a fragment of light that should not be left to the tides. Elrond's gaze darkened slightly. There was only rumor, a gem, they said, a thing of light. Not just any light, Elrond, she whispered. A shard of the Silmarils. Elrond stiffened. That is not possible. Is it not? She asked, her voice barely more than a breath. Have we not learned that time does not erase all things? That even the past, when it wishes, may stir? She looked back into the night, her eyes gleaming like polished gold. I do not seek to claim it, Elrond. I seek only to guard it before I leave this land forever. For I fear that others, those who remember the dark years, may yet seek it. A silence stretched between them, filled only by the rustling leaves. At last, Elrond exhaled, his shoulders easing beneath the weight of understanding. You will not be dissuaded. It was not a question. Galadriel smiled faintly. No. He nodded once, solemn. Then go swiftly, my lady, and may the light of the west guide you. With the hush of night as her witness, Galadriel turned her gaze one last time upon the golden wood, upon the land she had built, the home she had cherished. Then, with the silent grace of the Eldar, she descended the stair and passed into the shadows of the trees. The stars above watched in quiet wonder as Galadriel, Lady of Lothlórien, walked once more upon the path of the past. A hush lay over the golden wood, thick as an autumn mist, weaving itself through the ancient boughs of Lothlórien. It was a silence steeped in memory, as if the trees themselves held their breath, listening to the quiet footfalls of their lady as she passed beneath their gilded canopy. Their golden leaves trembled in the still air, rustling with whispers of an age now fading. The stars above shimmered in their endless vigil, watching as Galadriel moved like a wraith of moonlight. Her white raiment gliding over the forest floor, leaving no trace of her passing. She felt the hush settle upon her shoulders, a mantle woven of time itself. These woods had once sung to her, a melody as bright and clear as the light of Lothlórien in the days of her youth. Now their song was fainter, softer, a lament echoing in the deep places of her heart. She had lingered in Middle-earth for too long, long past the days of splendor, past the days of sorrow, when her kin had fallen beneath the doom they had wrought upon themselves. And yet she had remained, through the shifting of lands and the rise and fall of countless kingdoms. She had borne witness to the world's ceaseless turning. But now, at last, she would leave. And yet, not yet. Not while a shadow still stirred in the deep places of the world. Not while a whisper of the past still lingered, calling across the vastness of time, reaching for hands long since turned to dust. A flickering light wavered through the trees ahead, silver bright, threading its way between the great trunks. It was the lady's mirror, the still pool that reflected things beyond the veil of sight. She felt its presence before she saw it, a soft hum in the air, like the murmur of waves upon a shore. She had not looked into its waters for an age, and yet she knew she must, for the past had stirred, and its voice could not be ignored. As she stepped into the glade, the light of the stars fell upon the waters, and the silver basin gleamed like the surface of a forgotten world, a presence behind her, a mere ripple in the quiet of the night. She had known he would follow. It was in his nature to seek understanding, even when all paths had already been set. You have always seen further than most. Elrond's voice was gentle, like the slow turning of a page in an ancient tome. His footsteps were nearly soundless, his form draped in the muted silver of moonlight. And yet, I wonder, he continued, stepping beside her, his gaze thoughtful, if in seeing so far, you do not also see too much. Galadriel let his words settle as she reached forward, her fingertips brushing the rim of the basin. The metal was cool beneath her touch. "You fear I chase phantoms," she said at last, her voice soft as the night itself. Elrond's gaze was deep and knowing, but sorrow lay beneath its surface, veiled yet present, like a river running beneath ice. "Not phantoms," he murmured, "but perhaps echoes, memories that linger, not because they still hold power, but because they have yet to fade from the heart." He studied her, and for a moment, something unspoken passed between them, a sorrow long carried, an understanding neither needed to voice. "You have carried the burdens of many ages, my lady," he said at last. "You have shaped the course of Middle-earth in ways few will ever know." And yet, his voice faltered, and for a moment, he seemed to hesitate. "And yet, you are still bound to the past, as if each age that has fallen away still clings to you like a cloak of mist. Do you not tire of it?" Galadriel turned her gaze upon him then, and the stars above seemed to still in their course, as if they too waited for her answer. "I do not seek the past for its own sake," she murmured, "nor do I wish to be bound by it. But time does not flow as men perceive it, Elrond. It does not wash away all things, as a river smooths the stones upon its bed. There are echoes, yes, but not all echoes are empty. Some are warnings, some are signs, and some, she trailed her fingers over the water's edge, and a faint ripple trembled across the still surface, as if the very pool itself had shuddered in response. Some are yet unfinished. Elrond watched as images flickered within the mirror's depths, shapes forming and dissolving like breath upon glass. A face, half shrouded in mist, a hand reaching for something unseen, and then a gleam of light, pale as moonstone, flickering at the edge of the world. The Albereth, Elrond breathed, his voice barely more than a whisper. "It is real," Galadriel said. Elrond's expression did not change, though his hands curled slightly at his sides. "Did you doubt me?" He exhaled slowly, as if he had not realized he had been holding his breath. "No," he admitted, "but I had hoped. I had hoped that if it were lost, it would remain so. That its power, whatever it may still hold, would fade, as the rest of our kindred's sorrows have faded." Galadriel lifted her gaze from the mirror, her expression unreadable. "Not all sorrows fade, Elrond." Silence stretched between them once more. The wind stirred the malorn leaves overhead, a sound like whispered secrets, like forgotten names carried upon the night. "You will leave soon," he said at last. It was not a question. Galadriel inclined her head. "Before the next full moon." Elrond sighed, and for a moment he seemed almost weary, as though the weight of many partings pressed upon him at once. Then, at last, he spoke. "Let me go with you." Galadriel smiled faintly, but there was something bittersweet in the curve of her lips. Her gaze turned westward, to where the dark mountains loomed beneath the endless sky. "No, Elrond, your path lies elsewhere." He studied her for a long moment, searching her gaze for something he did not name. At last, he nodded, though reluctance darkened his expression. "Then may the valor guide your steps." "And yours," she whispered. She turned from the mirror, her mind already upon the road ahead, upon the path that wound back through the veils of time. The trees whispered as she passed beneath them, their golden leaves shifting in the night air, as if offering her their silent farewells. And far beyond the reaches of Lothlórien, past the rivers and hills and valleys of the world, something stirred, a whisper, a light, a memory waiting to be found. The night deepened over Lothlórien, the golden leaves trembling under the unseen breath of the world. It was a night like many before, and yet it felt different. There was a weight in the air, a hush that settled over the forest like a held breath. The silver river Nimrodel flowed gently through the vale, its waters dark as polished obsidian beneath the starlight, reflecting the heavens in rippling, broken patterns. The trees stood as silent witnesses to the moment unfolding beneath their boughs. Galadriel moved through the great wood with a step as light as moonbeams upon still waters, but within her heart a storm gathered. She had known many roads, had seen the rise and fall of countless kingdoms, had guided her people through ages of light and shadow. And now, after all these years, she was walking toward the end of an age she had shaped. But before she could cross the sea, before she could surrender to the call of the West, there was still one last path she must take. She did not turn when she heard the footsteps behind her, though she had known he would come. His presence was as familiar to her as the trees themselves, as constant as the rivers that wound through this land. Celeborn had always been her anchor, the steady hand that held fast even when the world shifted. She had carried the weight of foresight, but he had carried the weight of what was. "Your thoughts are far from Lothlórien," he said, his voice quiet, yet unshaken. Galadriel exhaled softly, her golden hair catching the moonlight as she tilted her head slightly, though she still did not turn to face him. "They have been for a long time," she admitted. Celeborn stepped beside her, his silver hair glinting like the light of ancient steel. His gaze, deep as the wells of time, rested upon her, searching for what she did not say. "Then you mean to leave?" She closed her eyes briefly before opening them again, casting her gaze across the trees she had nurtured for centuries. "Yes," she said. Celeborn was silent for a long time. The only sound was the gentle stirring of the leaves, the distant murmur of the Nimrodal. At last, he spoke. "You have always been restless, Galadriel. Even in the early days, before we set foot in these woods, I saw the way you looked beyond them, as if searching for something you could not name." He turned to her then, his voice touched with something softer. "You built this realm, made it more than mere land and stone. And yet, I have always known you would not remain here forever." Galadriel finally met his gaze, and there was a sorrow in her eyes that had been buried beneath years of wisdom and resolve. "It was never because I did not love this land," she said. "Nor was it because I wished to leave you." Celeborn inclined his head slightly, his expression unreadable, though she knew him too well to believe he was unmoved. "And yet, you will go." She sighed, and for a moment, she allowed herself to reach for his hand, her fingers brushing lightly against his. He did not pull away, but nor did he seek to hold her there. Some things could not be undone. Some paths, once chosen, must be walked alone. "You do not intend to return," he murmured. Galadriel hesitated, and in that moment, she felt the full weight of the choice she had already made. No. A silence stretched between them, filled with the voices of the wind, the whispers of the ancient trees. Celeborn's shoulders eased slightly, and though his expression did not falter, she knew him well enough to sense the sorrow that ran beneath his quiet acceptance. "Then let me walk with you," he said, "for as long as the road allows." Galadriel studied him for a long moment, searching for something unspoken. Then, at last, she inclined her head. "Then let us walk," she murmured. They moved through the golden wood together, their steps silent, their path winding through the trees like a thread unwoven from the great tapestry of time. It was not the road of war, nor the path of conquest or rule. It was the path of an ending, of a farewell long in the making. They had walked many roads before, but this one was different. This one would not lead back again. The stars wheeled slowly overhead, their light cold and unchanging, untouched by the sorrows of the world below. As they walked, the trees around them seemed to lean in, as if listening, as if bearing witness to the parting of two who had once been as inseparable as the roots of the Malorn trees. At last, they reached the edge of the wood, where the land sloped gently downward toward the river. The scent of damp earth filled the air, mingled with the crisp breath of autumn. The world beyond stretched vast and unknown, a place untouched by elven hands, where the trees no longer whispered in immortal tongues, where the air no longer carried the song of the Eldar. Celeborn exhaled slowly, his gaze fixed upon the path ahead. And so, the road takes you from me. Galadriel turned to him, her golden eyes filled with something deep, something ancient. No, she whispered. The road has always been leading me forward, but I will carry you with me, as I always have. Celeborn studied her for a long time, then at last, he inclined his head. Then go with my blessing, he said. She stepped forward, beyond the last golden trees of Lothlórien, beyond the land she had called home for so long. The wind stirred behind her, rustling the leaves as if whispering its own farewell. She did not look back, for the road ahead was waiting, and far beyond the reaches of the golden wood, past the rivers and hills and valleys of the world, something stirred, a whisper, a light, a memory waiting to be found. The forest stretched before them, vast and unknowable, its roots tangled with the weight of time, its leaves whispering of things yet to come. The night was deep, and the air carried the scent of damp earth, of unseen rivers winding their way through the valleys beyond. The further they walked, the more the golden glow of Lothlórien faded behind them, until it was nothing more than a distant shimmer swallowed by the trees. Galadriel moved as one who had walked many such paths before, yet there was a heaviness in her steps now, as if the weight of what she left behind clung to her like mist upon the air. Celeborn walked beside her, his presence as steady as it had always been. Yet she knew he felt it too, the shift in the world, the parting that could not be undone. They had stood side by side for countless years, their fates intertwined like the roots of the Malorn trees. And yet, even the oldest trees must one day let go of their leaves. For a time, they walked in silence, the hush of the night settling between them like an unspoken farewell. The stars wheeled above, cold and unchanging, their silver fire untouched by the sorrows of those who walked beneath them. At last, it was Celeborn who spoke, his voice low and measured. You do not intend to turn back. It was not a question. Galadriel glanced at him, her golden eyes shimmering like starlight on water. No, he exhaled, tilting his head slightly as he considered her words. And yet, there is something you seek before you leave. She did not answer immediately. allowing the wind to carry her thoughts before she gave them shape. At last, she murmured, "There is something left undone, a thread of the past that has not yet unraveled." Celeborn studied her, his silver eyes dark with thought. "You have always walked ahead, Galadriel," he said. "Even in the earliest days, when we first set foot upon these shores, I knew that your path would not always run alongside mine. I have never sought to hold you back." And yet, he hesitated. "There is a sorrow in this parting that I had not foreseen." Galadriel looked at him fully now, and for the first time in many long years, she reached for his hand. Her fingers, light as a breath upon the wind, curled around his, grounding them both in this fleeting moment. "It is not sorrow alone that lingers between us," she whispered. "It is love, and love does not fade, Celeborn, even when the road takes us apart." He did not speak, but his fingers tightened around hers in silent understanding. They walked on, the land shifting around them as the trees grew taller, their trunks thick with the weight of centuries. The golden leaves of Lothlórien had given way to deeper shades of green and silver, the scent of the earth richer, more ancient. These were lands untouched by the hands of the Eldar, places where the memory of their kind was but a whisper on the wind. At last, they reached a river, its waters dark and swift beneath the pale light of the moon. The land beyond it stretched wild and untamed, a place forgotten by time. Galadriel paused at the water's edge, gazing across the rippling current as if searching for something unseen. "This is where I leave you," Celeborn said. His voice was quiet, but there was a weight to it, a finality that neither of them could deny. Galadriel turned to him, the wind stirring her golden hair around her shoulders. "You will not follow me." Celeborn shook his head. "No, my road leads elsewhere." She inclined her head, as if she had known all along that this would be their parting. And perhaps she had. "Then this is goodbye." He exhaled slowly, his gaze never leaving hers. "No, Galadriel, not goodbye. Only the end of one path and the beginning of another." For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then, slowly, Galadriel reached up, her fingers brushing lightly against his cheek. It was a touch not of farewell, but of remembrance. A promise that, though their roads would lead them apart, they would never truly be lost to one another. "May the stars shine upon your path, my lord," she whispered. Celeborn's lips parted, as if there were words he wished to say, but in the end, he simply nodded. "And may the light of the west guide yours, my lady." Then, with one last lingering glance, Galadriel turned and stepped into the river. The water rose around her ankles, cool and smooth as silk, but she did not pause. She moved forward, her steps steady, her purpose unwavering. Celeborn watched as she crossed the river, his hands resting at his sides, though she knew he longed to reach for her one last time. But he did not. He simply stood, a silent figure upon the shore, watching as she disappeared into the night. Galadriel did not look back. The road ahead was waiting. and far beyond the borders of this world, past the hills and the valleys, past the rivers and the trees, something stirred. A whisper, a light, a memory waiting to be found. The river's chill clung to Galadriel's skin as she stepped onto the far bank, the water slipping away like silvered threads unraveling from the hem of her cloak. She did not turn to see if Celeborn still watched from the opposite shore. The moment of parting had passed, and to look back would be to linger in a time that could not be reclaimed. Her road was before her now, winding through the deep lands of Middle-earth, into the places where memory had long since faded into myth. The trees here were not like those of Lothlórien. They did not glow with golden fire, nor murmur in the tongues of the Eldar. Their trunks were dark, their boughs twisted, their roots clawing deep into the earth, as though they sought to anchor themselves against the passage of time. These were the woods of forgotten things, of old whispers carried upon the wind, where no elf had walked in an age. Galadriel moved like a shadow of moonlight, silent and unseen, though she knew the land was aware of her passing. The air was heavy with an unseen presence, something ancient and watching, something that stirred in the silence between heartbeats. The deeper she walked, the stronger it became, pressing against the edges of her mind like the echo of a voice she could not yet hear. She knew what she sought. Eindillion. The name had come to her not as sound, but as knowing, a whisper from the past carried on the wind, a thread of fate left unwoven. There had been 3 Silmarils, their light shaped from the essence of the 2 trees, their history, one of beauty, betrayal, and doom. One had been lost to the depths of the sea, another swallowed by the fires of the earth, and the last taken into the heavens. Yet legends spoke of a fragment, a splinter of light that had broken away before the end, a piece too small to be called a Silmaril, yet still of the same fire. Eindillion had carried it. He had been among the last of those who had stood against Morgoth in the great wars of the First Age, a warrior whose deeds had faded from song, whose name was spoken only in the quiet places where the Eldar still remembered. He had vanished before the breaking of Beleriand, swallowed by the ruin that had drowned those lands beneath the sea. And with him, the last fragment of the sacred light had been lost, or so it had been believed. But Galadriel had seen it, not in visions of the future, but in the depths of the mirror. A shard of light, glimmering in the darkness of a place unseen, waiting. It should not have been there. Time should have buried it, as it buried all things. And yet, it remained. She could not allow it to be found by another. The night deepened as she walked, the trees stretching taller, their canopies so thick that even the stars could not reach through. The silence was heavier here, weighted with something nameless, as if the very land held its breath. The wind stirred, carrying with it the scent of damp earth, of stone worn smooth by forgotten rivers, of something older than memory itself. Then she heard it, not the whisper of leaves nor the distant call of night birds, but something deeper. A hum, low and steady, vibrating beneath her feet, pulsing through the air like the echo of a song long since ended. It was not sound, not in the way voices carried through the world. It was something else, a presence, a lingering thing. She stepped forward, her fingers brushing against the bark of an ancient tree, its surface rough beneath her touch. She closed her eyes, listening not with her ears, but with something deeper. And there it was, a flicker, a memory that did not belong to her, yet reached for her all the same. A figure standing upon the edge of a crumbling shore, the sea raging behind him, the sky dark with fire. A hand lifting something bright, something that pulsed with the light of ages past. And then silence. The image shattered like glass into darkness, and Galadriel's eyes flew open. She knew where she must go. Ahead, the trees thinned, giving way to the ruins of something ancient. Not a city, not a fortress, but something older, something nameless. Great stones jutted from the earth like the bones of a world long dead, their surfaces worn by time, their purpose lost to all but the land itself. And there, at the heart of it, half buried beneath the roots of a tree grown thick with age, lay an archway of black stone, a doorway. Galadriel stepped closer, the air shifting around her, the hum growing stronger, resonating through her bones like the beating of a heart. She reached out, her fingers barely grazing the surface of the stone. It was cold, and yet, beneath that cold, there was something else, something that stirred at her touch, a memory waiting to be woken. She inhaled slowly, steadying herself, and then, with the quiet resolve of one who had already chosen her path, she stepped through. The world shifted. Darkness closed around her, not the darkness of night, but something deeper, something untouched by the passing of time. The hum became a whisper, winding through the air like unseen hands reaching toward her, calling her forward. The ground beneath her feet was smooth, worn by the passage of many before her, though no footsteps marked its surface. Then light, faint, distant, yet unmistakable. A glow, pulsing in the farthest reaches of the shadowed passage before her, flickering like a star upon the edge of oblivion. The fragment, Galadriel's breath caught. It was real. It was here. She moved forward, her heart steady, her purpose clear. The past had not been buried. Not yet. And far beyond the ruins, past the rivers and the mountains, past the lands where memory had faded into myth, something stirred. A whisper, a light, a truth waiting to be found. The darkness pressed in around her, thick and silent, a void untouched by time. The air was cool, carrying the scent of stone and earth, of something long buried beneath the weight of centuries. Galadriel moved forward with measured steps, her breath steady, though the hum that filled this place vibrated through her very bones. It was not sound, but something deeper, a presence woven into the fabric of the air itself. The faint glow in the distance pulsed, flickering like a distant star, guiding her forward. Each step brought her closer to something she had long believed lost, something that had existed only in whispers and forgotten tales. Dillion had carried it into the depths of ruin, and now she had followed the last echoes of his passing into the heart of the forgotten world. The passage narrowed, the stone walls curving inward like the ribs of some vast, ancient beast. The ground beneath her feet was smooth, worn by the passage of ages, though no footprints marked its surface. The deeper she went, the heavier the air became, as though the weight of time itself gathered in this place, pressing against her with unseen hands. Then, at last, she stepped into the chamber. It was vast, its ceiling lost to shadow, its walls carved with sigils so worn by time that their meaning had faded. But at its center, untouched by the decay that had claimed the rest, there lay a pedestal of black stone, and atop it, resting upon a bed of shimmering dust, was the light she had seen in the mirror. The fragment, it was no larger than a pearl, its surface smooth and unbroken, pulsing faintly with a radiance not of this world. Not gold nor silver, but something deeper, something that flickered with the memory of the two trees, of an age before the world had been reshaped. A shard of the Silmarils. Galadriel inhaled softly, her fingers hovering just above the stone. The air around it shimmered, charged with something ancient, something neither of light nor darkness, but beyond them both. This was not the full fire of Fëanor's creation, not the unbroken radiance that had once been set in the crown of Morgoth. It was only a splinter, a fraction of the light that had shaped the fate of the world. And yet, even now, even after all these ages, it burned. She reached forward, but before her fingers could close around it, the air shifted. A whisper, not from the stone, but from the shadows beyond the chamber. A voice without sound, a presence that had waited, lingering in the silence of forgotten things. Galadriel turned sharply, her golden eyes narrowing as she searched the darkness. She was not alone. A shape moved at the edge of the chamber, a flicker of something just beyond sight, its form shifting like smoke caught in an unseen wind. It did not breathe, did not stir the air, yet she felt it watching, waiting. Then, as if stirred by the presence of the light itself, it spoke. "Long have I waited." The voice was low, ancient, woven from the echoes of a time lost to all but the stars. It was not wholly elven, nor of the tongues of men or dwarves. It was something else, something forgotten. Galadriel did not move, though her fingers curled slightly at her sides. "Who are you?" Silence stretched, deep as the void beyond the world. Then slowly, the figure stepped forward, its form resolving from shadow into something half seen, half remembered. Cloaked in what remained of tattered raiment, its edges frayed by time, the figure was neither living nor dead, neither whole nor broken. Its face was hidden, its hands gloved in fabric worn thin by the weight of centuries. But its presence was known to her, not by name nor by sight, once been. You seek the light, the figure murmured, as others before you have sought it, as others before you have fallen beneath its weight. Galadriel studied the figure, her mind sifting through the long tapestry of memory, through the names and faces of those who had once carried the burdens of this world. And then she knew. Eindillion. You are him, she said, her voice quiet but unwavering. Or what remains of him? The figure tilted its head, as if considering the words, as if searching through the remnants of itself to find what had once been. I was, it said at last. I am no longer. Galadriel took a slow step forward. Why do you linger? Eindillion's form wavered, as if his very presence strained against the passage of time. Because the light does not belong in this world. It was meant to fade, to be lost beneath the tide, beyond the reach of those who would claim it. And yet, it remained. His gaze, if he had eyes at all, shifted toward the fragment upon the pedestal. And so did I. Galadriel hesitated. You protected it. I was bound to it. A silence passed between them, the weight of centuries pressing against the edges of the moment. Then softly, Eindillion spoke again. Why have you come? Galadriel exhaled, her gaze steady. Because it cannot be left here. Not in a world that has not yet outlived its greed. There are those who would seek it, who would wield it, who would twist what was once pure into something dark. I cannot allow that to happen. Eindillion was still for a long moment. Then, slowly, he turned his gaze back to her. And what will you do with it, daughter of Finarfin? Galadriel did not look away. I will take it beyond the reach of those who would seek to claim it. I will take it where no shadow may follow. A pause. Then, for the first time, the faintest trace of something passed through the remnants of Eindillion's presence. Not warmth, not sorrow, but understanding. Then take it, he said, and let me rest. Galadriel stepped forward, her fingers closing around the shard. The moment she touched it, a warmth pulsed through her, not like fire, not like light, but something older, something that had been carried across ages, through sorrow and loss, waiting for this moment. The hum in the chamber ceased. The shadows at its edges wavered, and Eindillion, the last guardian of the fragment, faded into the darkness, his form dissolving like mist before the rising sun. Galadriel stood alone. The shard rested in her palm, its glow steady, unyielding. It was not hers to wield, not hers to claim, but it was hers to protect. She turned toward the passage from which she had come, the weight of the fragment settling against her palm, like the whisper of a world long past. The past had not yet faded, but now it would be carried where none could follow, and far beyond the ruins, beyond the mountains and the rivers, beyond the lands where memory still lingered. Something shifted, a whisper, a light, a destiny waiting to unfold. The chamber behind her lay in silence, the air still thick with the remnants of things long past. The weight of history clung to the stones, as if the world itself had paused in reverence for the passing of Eindillion. But Galadriel did not linger. The fragment pulsed faintly against her palm, its light steady yet subdued, as though even it knew that its journey was not yet over. She stepped back into the tunnel, her footfalls whispering against the smooth stone. The darkness pressed in around her, but it was no longer the consuming void it had been before. There was purpose in its silence, an understanding that something had shifted. The past had been acknowledged, and now it could rest. As she emerged into the open air, the wind greeted her, cool and cleansing, carrying with it the scent of the river and the distant breath of the sea. The stars above remained unchanged, their cold fire untouched by the passage of time, watching as they had since the dawn of Arda. Galadriel tilted her head slightly, listening. The world beyond this place was waiting, but she had no intention of returning the way she had come. Lothlórien, with its golden boughs and silver rivers, lay behind her now. The path ahead was uncertain, but her purpose was clear. She turned westward. The journey back to the sea would not be a simple one. The world had changed in the wake of Sauron's defeat, and though the great shadow had passed, its echoes remained, lingering in the hearts of those who had tasted its power. There would be those who would seek to claim what she carried, though they did not yet know of its existence. And so, she would not travel as the Lady of Lothlórien, draped in finery and light. She would move unseen, a whisper upon the wind, until at last she reached the shore where the white ships waited. The land stretched before her, vast and untamed. The forests thinned, giving way to rolling hills and distant plains where the air was filled with the scent of earth and rain. She walked as one who belonged to the wild places, her steps light, her presence unnoticed by the creatures that stirred in the night. Days passed, though she did not mark them. Time was different now, slipping through her fingers like water, measured only by the shifting of the sky and the quiet pulse of the fragment against her palm. Then, as dusk settled over the land, she sensed it. A presence, not the lingering whisper of Eindillion, nor the distant hum of the fragment, but something else, something watching. She did not slow her pace, nor did she turn, but she let her senses stretch outward, listening beyond the wind and the rustling of the trees. The feeling was faint, yet unmistakable, a shadow upon the edges of her awareness, lingering just beyond sight. She was not alone. Galadriel continued walking, allowing the night to deepen around her. But within, her thoughts sharpened. There were few in this world who could follow her unseen, fewer still who could move with such quiet skill that even she could not yet mark their face. Then the presence shifted. A step, light as falling leaves, a breath just beyond the reach of the wind. She stopped. The silence stretched, deep and endless. "Then you have walked far, my lady." The voice was low, smooth as river stone, familiar, yet unexpected. A figure emerged from the trees, wrapped in a cloak of deep green. its edges brushed with silver embroidery. He moved with the grace of one who had walked the hidden paths of the world for centuries, his form tall and unbowed. His hood fell back slightly, revealing keen eyes that glinted beneath the starlight. Thranduil. Galadriel inclined her head ever so slightly, her expression unreadable. "King of the woodland realm," she said, her voice soft but steady. "It has been many years since we last spoke." Thranduil stepped forward, his gaze sweeping over her as though searching for something unspoken. "And yet," he said, "I find you upon the road, walking alone, as if you are no more than a wandering traveler." He paused, his eyes narrowing. "But you are not alone, are you?" Galadriel met his gaze evenly, but she did not answer. Thranduil tilted his head slightly, his silver hair catching the faint light. "I felt it as you passed through my borders, a presence, an echo of something unnatural." He studied her, his voice quieter now, more intent. "What is it that you carry, Galadriel?" She remained still for a moment, considering her words. There were few she trusted with such knowledge, and though Thranduil had always been proud, distant, even he was no fool. He understood the weight of history, the burdens of power, and he knew well enough that not all things should be wielded. At last, she opened her hand slightly, just enough for the faintest sliver of light to escape from between her fingers. Thranduil's breath stilled. "A shard of the Silmarils," he murmured, his voice barely more than a whisper. Galadriel closed her fingers around it once more, sealing away its light. "It is not meant to remain here." Thranduil's gaze darkened. "Then why do you not cast it into the sea? Let it be lost, as the others were, because it must be carried beyond the reach of this world," she said. "And only I can take it there." Thranduil exhaled slowly, his expression unreadable. "The greed of men is not so easily buried. There are those who would seek what you carry, if they knew of it." "I know," she said. For a long moment, they stood in silence, two remnants of a world that was fading, two souls who had seen too many ages turn. Then, at last, Thranduil took a slow step back. "You should not linger here," he said. "The roads beyond these woods are not as empty as they once were. Stray hands still reach for things they do not understand." Galadriel inclined her head slightly. "Then I shall not linger." Thranduil hesitated for only a fraction of a moment before he spoke again. "And should you need it," he said quietly, "there are still those in these lands who would stand at your side, should you call." Galadriel studied him, and for the first time, she allowed the faintest ghost of a smile to touch her lips. "You have changed, Thranduil." He did not return her smile, but his expression softened, if only slightly. "Perhaps," he admitted. Then, with a final glance toward the fragment hidden within her grasp, he turned. "May the stars guide you, Lady of Lothlórien, and may the forests keep you, King of the woodland realm," she murmured. With that, Thranduil vanished into the trees, his presence melting back into the shadows, as swiftly as it had come. Galadriel stood for a moment longer, listening to the whispering wind, to the silent hum of the fragment against her skin. Then, without another word, she turned westward. The sea was waiting, and far beyond the forests, beyond the rivers and the hills, something stirred. A whisper, a light, an ending waiting to be written. The night stretched vast and silent around her, the trees whispering farewell as Galadriel passed beyond the borders of Thranduil's realm. She did not look back, for there was no need. Her road was set, winding ever westward toward the sea, toward the end of all things she had known. The fragment pulsed faintly against her palm, a quiet heartbeat of light, steady, waiting. The land changed as she traveled. The dense forests of the east gave way to rolling plains, their grasses swaying like waves beneath the shifting winds. The scent of the earth was rich here, untamed, filled with the quiet hum of things that had never known the touch of elven hands. The stars above remained constant, their cold light illuminating the path before her, guiding her through the vastness of Middle-earth. She moved unseen, a shadow among the wild places, leaving no mark upon the world she would soon depart. But as the days passed, she felt the weight of unseen eyes upon her, the faint echo of something lingering just beyond the veil of the night. She was being followed. It was not Thranduil, nor any of his kin. This presence was different, subtler, more careful, but no less determined. It did not move like a hunter, nor did it carry the scent of orcs or wraiths. It was something else, something patient. Galadriel did not falter. She continued westward, her pace measured, her steps deliberate, allowing the presence to reveal itself. It did not strike, did not call out, but it remained, trailing her through the hills and valleys, always just beyond reach. Then, on the seventh night, beneath a sky silvered with starlight, she stopped. "You have walked in silence for long enough," she said softly, her voice carrying across the quiet expanse. "Step forward and let the night reveal you." For a moment, nothing stirred. Then, from the shadows of a nearby hill, a figure emerged. It was not a soldier, nor a thief, nor a wandering soul lost upon the road. It was a man cloaked and hooded, his steps careful yet unhesitating. He moved with the ease of one who had traveled far, but there was no malice in his bearing, no hunger for what she carried, only purpose. Galadriel studied him as he approached, her golden gaze steady. He was not of Numenor, nor of the high houses of Gondor, but there was wisdom in his step, an awareness that set him apart from the lesser wanderers of this world. At last, the man stopped a few paces away, tilting his head slightly. "I did not think you would call me forward so easily," he said, his voice low, edged with something rougher than elven speech, but not unkind. Galadriel did not smile, but there was something in her expression that softened, if only slightly. "Few in this world can follow me without my knowing," she said. "Fewer still would have the patience to do so without revealing their intent. "You are not a thief, nor are you a hunter. Tell me, then, who are you?" The man hesitated, then slowly pushed back his hood, revealing dark hair streaked with silver, eyes sharp as a blade's edge, lined with the weight of years. He was no longer young, but neither was he old, and though his face was marked by time, it was the gaze of one who had seen much and carried more. "My name is Hien," he said. "I am of the north." Galadriel considered him. "A ranger, then?" "Aye," he admitted. "Once, though I have not called myself such in many years." He glanced toward her hand, though he did not try to glimpse what she carried. "I have followed you not for what you bear, but for what follows in its wake." Galadriel's gaze did not waver. "And what is it you have seen?" Hien exhaled, as though weighing his words. "There is a shadow upon the road, my lady. Not a great one, not like that which was cast by the dark lord before his fall. But something lingers, drawn to you. It moves as I do, without sound, without trace. It does not seek to claim what you carry. It seeks only to know where it is going." Galadriel's fingers tightened slightly around the fragment, though her expression remained calm. "And yet, you chose to follow as well." Hien met her gaze evenly. "Because I would know whether it is friend or foe. And if it is foe, then you should not walk alone." A silence stretched between them, filled only by the distant murmur of the wind over the grasslands. At last, Galadriel inclined her head slightly. "You are bold, Hien of the North." He let out a quiet breath, half a laugh, though there was little mirth in it. "So I have been told." She turned her gaze toward the horizon, where the land sloped gently toward the western reaches, where the sea waited beyond sight. "If you would walk this road beside me, then do so. But know this, what I carry must not be touched, nor sought, nor spoken of beyond this night. Do you understand?" Hien hesitated, then nodded. "I do." Galadriel studied him for a moment longer, then turned without another word, continuing down the path. Hien followed, his footsteps light, his presence no longer concealed. They moved westward together, two souls bound by different fates, their steps carrying them toward the unseen shore. The wind stirred around them, rustling through the grass, whispering of things yet to come, and far beyond the hills, past the rivers and the mountains, past the lands where memory still lingered, something stirred, a whisper, a light, a fate waiting to unfold. The road wound ever westward, stretching across the vast expanse of Middle-earth, through hills and valleys, where the world lay untouched by the hands of elves or men. The sky above remained endless, silvered with the quiet glow of unseen constellations, their light distant, watchful. Galadriel moved with silent purpose, her golden hair trailing like woven starlight in the night's breeze. Beside her, Hien walked with the steady patience of one who had spent a lifetime upon the road. For a time, neither spoke. There was no need. The weight of the journey settled upon them both, each step carrying them closer to a destination neither had spoken aloud. Yet both understood. The sea, the end of all roads. And yet, even now, the shadow lingered. Hien felt it first. His stride slowed ever so slightly, his hand shifting toward the hilt of the blade at his hip. It was not a presence he could see, nor one he could place, but something in the air had changed, a subtle shift, a whisper upon the wind that did not belong. Galadriel, too, had sensed it. She did not turn nor falter, but within, her thoughts sharpened, weaving through the unseen threads of the world around her. The presence that had trailed them was no longer content to watch from afar. It was drawing nearer. At last, Hien spoke, his voice low. "It follows still." Galadriel inclined her head slightly. "Yes." Hien exhaled, casting a glance toward the darkened horizon. "It has had many chances to strike, yet it has not." He hesitated. "What waits for us at the end of this road, my lady?" Galadriel did not answer at first. She let the silence stretch between them, her fingers tightening slightly around the fragment she carried. Its light pulsed faintly beneath her palm, a quiet heartbeat of something older than the lands they walked upon. At last, she murmured, "Not all that follows is enemy, and not all that lingers does so with ill intent." Hien considered her words. "Then what is it?" She sighed, her voice soft, yet edged with something distant, something knowing. A remnant, a watcher of what once was. Hien frowned, a ghost. Galadriel's lips curved faintly, though there was little warmth in the expression. Of a kind. The night deepened around them, the wind stirring through the tall grasses, carrying with it the hush of unseen things. Then, at last, as if summoned by their words, the presence stepped forward. A figure emerged from the darkness, its form shifting like mist against the silvered night. It was tall, wrapped in the remnants of tattered black, its face obscured beneath the hood of a cloak worn thin by centuries. It did not breathe. It did not stir the air. And yet, it stood before them, watching. Hien's fingers curled around the hilt of his blade, though he did not yet draw it. His muscles tensed, his stance shifting ever so slightly, ready, waiting. But Galadriel did not reach for a weapon. Instead, she stepped forward. "You have followed me long," she said, her voice carrying across the quiet land. "Why do you linger?" The figure did not move at first. Then, slowly, it lifted its head, and beneath the shadows of its hood, two faint points of light flickered dim, like embers long cooled, but not yet extinguished. "I was bound," it murmured. The voice was hollow, distant, as if it belonged to something that had long since been forgotten by time itself. Bound to the light, bound to the past. Galadriel's gaze did not waver. "You seek the fragment." The figure inclined its head slightly. "I do not seek to claim it." A pause, heavy with something unspoken. Only to see it carried to its end. Hien's grip did not loosen. "And why should we believe you?" The figure turned its gaze toward him, those dim, flickering lights resting upon his face. because I was once as you are." A silence stretched between them. The wind stirred. The stars wheeled slowly overhead. At last, Galadriel spoke. "You were one of the lost." The figure exhaled, though it was not the breath of the living. "I was." Hallion's eyes narrowed. "Eindillion." The figure did not answer, but something in the air shifted, as though the name itself stirred something deep within the remnants of what remained. Galadriel stepped closer. "You swore to guard the light, even as the world turned against you." The figure inclined its head. "And so I have." "You have lingered long beyond your time," Galadriel said softly. "What is it you seek?" The figure was still for a long moment. Then, with the weight of ages behind its words, it whispered, "To know that it will not fall into shadow." The silence that followed was deep, filled only by the hush of the wind. Galadriel's golden eyes met the dim glow of the figure, and for a moment, something passed between them, something older than words, something woven from the threads of memory itself. At last, she lifted her hand. Slowly, deliberately, she opened her fingers. The fragment of light pulsed faintly against her palm, its glow untouched by time, by ruin, by the long passage of sorrow. The figure did not reach for it. It only watched. Then, ever so slowly, the flickering embers of its gaze dimmed. "I see now," it murmured. "It will not be lost." A hush settled over the land. The wind carried the whisper of something dissolving, something finally unburdened. And then, with the quiet grace of a shadow meeting the dawn, the figure faded. Hallion exhaled, his grip on his sword relaxing at last. He cast a glance toward Galadriel. "That was not a ghost," he said. "No," Galadriel murmured. "It was a promise kept." The night stretched vast and quiet around them once more. The stars above burned cold and unchanging, and the sea, though still unseen, called ever closer. Hallion turned his gaze westward. "Then this is the end of our road." Galadriel closed her fingers around the fragment once more, her expression unreadable. "Not yet." She stepped forward, and Hallion followed, and far beyond the lands they walked, past the rivers and the mountains, past the echoes of memory and time. Something stirred, a whisper, a light, a farewell waiting to be spoken. The wind carried the scent of the sea. It was faint at first, barely more than a whisper upon the air, mingling with the scent of earth and rain. But as Galadriel walked, it grew stronger, sharper, until it filled the space around her, curling through her golden hair, brushing against her skin like the breath of an old song calling her home. Hallion walked beside her, silent. He had not questioned her since the night the shadow had faded, since the last lingering remnant of Eindillion had been unbound from the world. There were no more voices from the past, no more unseen watchers upon the road. Only the journey that remained, and the fate that awaited at its end. The land sloped gently downward, and at last, beyond the final ridge of the hills, the great waters stretched before them, The sea, it was endless, shimmering beneath the pale light of the rising moon, its waves rolling in a rhythm as old as time itself. The air was thick with salt, with the distant cry of unseen gulls, with the hush of the tide pulling at the shore. And there, waiting beneath the starlit sky, lay the white ships. Galadriel stood still, watching them, listening to the quiet murmur of the waves against the wood, the faint creak of the hulls as they swayed upon the tide. They were vessels of the Eldar, woven with light, built not for war, nor for conquest, but for passage, for the final journey of those who would leave Middle-earth behind. Her time had come. She turned to Hien. He had stopped a few paces behind her, his gaze fixed upon the sea, though he did not step forward. He was of Middle-earth, bound to its lands, to its fate. This was not his road to walk. "This is where we part," she said softly. Hien exhaled, tilting his head slightly, as if listening to the rhythm of the waves. "I suppose it is." For a long moment, neither spoke. The wind stirred around them, carrying the scent of salt and distant shores. Then Hien turned to her, his sharp, weathered eyes studying her carefully. "Do you regret it?" he asked. Galadriel lifted a single golden brow. "Regret what?" "Leaving," he said. "Not just Middle-earth, but all of it. The weight, the power, the shaping of things." He hesitated, then added, "The ones you leave behind." Galadriel was silent, not because she did not have an answer, but because the answer was not a simple one. Finally, she spoke. "There is always grief in leaving," she murmured, "but there is also peace." Hien studied her for a long moment, then gave a quiet, knowing nod. He understood. She reached into the folds of her cloak and withdrew the fragment. It gleamed softly against her palm, a shimmer of something untouched by time, untouched by ruin. She held it for a moment longer, feeling its warmth, its weight, the last remnant of the fire that had once burned at the heart of the world. Then she turned toward the sea. The waves whispered against the shore, a lullaby of something ancient, something endless. She stepped forward, the cool water brushing against her feet as she waded deeper, the white ships waiting just beyond reach. And then, when she stood at the edge of the tide, she lifted the fragment in her hands. She did not hesitate. With a single motion, she cast it into the sea. The light fell, slipping beneath the waves, sinking into the depths where no shadow would ever reach it again. The water swallowed it in silence, and for a moment, the ocean glowed, pulsing with the last echo of something that had waited far too long to be set free. Then the light faded. It was done. Galadriel turned. Hien still stood upon the shore, watching. He did not speak, but in his eyes she saw understanding. The choice had been made. The past had been laid to rest. She inclined her head slightly, offering him a final farewell. Then, with the grace of one who had long since accepted her fate, she stepped onto the waiting ship. The sails unfurled. The wind caught them, pulling the vessel forward, out beyond the reach of the shore, out beyond the lands of Middle-earth. The waves carried her westward, toward the straight road, toward the undying lands, toward the place where no grief, no shadow, no weight of memory could follow. Hien remained upon the shore, watching as the ship grew smaller, as it vanished into the horizon, as the last light of the Lady of Lothlórien faded from Middle-earth forever, and far beyond the waves, past the edge of the known world, past the places where time could touch, something stirred, a whisper, a light, a new beginning waiting to unfold. The end